Welcome to Reading Block 9 on Gender and Family. We are going to be taking a feminist approach, a very blatant feminist approach to this reading block. But I do have a spoiler alert for all of you. All of this class has been from a feminist approach. So don't feel like I'm suddenly, turning a 180 on any of you. Um, this is just my coming out as a feminist, as an explicit feminist to you in video form, because that is on my first page of the syllabus anyway, that I am um, an intersectional feminist. I belong to the fourth wave of feminism, and um, what does that mean when I say fourth wave of feminism? Well, we're going to go through the stages or waves of feminism for this video. When we're talking about the feminism stages, there are different periods of time when there were outspoken women and men who led the fight for um, equality and equity between the different genders. Usually, when we think about the first wave of feminism, we think about the fight for suffrage and being allowed, and the women for being allowed to vote. And something that I want you to keep in mind is that although when we look at this first wave, people usually think about the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, and how that marked the start, and then how it continued on until the 1920 ratification of women's suffrage. We do see that before that and during that period, the abolition movement was advocating for both racial and gender equality, and that included a lot of very prominent African Americans at the time, and that includes people like Sojourner Truth, as well as people like Frederick Douglass, who were advocating not only for the equality of black people, but the equality of women. This is kind of like the beginning, really, of what we call intersectional feminism. However, we didn't really, there weren't any words really to talk about that at the time. I do want you to keep this in mind because the suffrage movement ended up splitting after the Emancipation Proclamation, and that was because of blatant racial discrimination. It stopped being about we need equality. It suddenly became about, well, now black men can vote, and now everything just being split off. There are other individuals that are very important for this time period. For example, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Ida B. Wells, and Anna Julia Cooper, many of them becoming um, educators in particular to educators and writers to pinpoint and focus on how there could not be any true racial equality without addressing the issue of gender equality. And so these women were really trying to make sure that everybody, not only males but and black males, but also white women, realized that these conversations had to happen together. There was another woman, Mary Church Terrell, who she synthesizes this in this quote: a white woman has only one handicap to overcome, that of sex. I have two, both sex and race. Colored men have only one, that of race. Colored women are the only group in this country who have two heavy handicaps to overcome, that of race as well as that of sex. I'm going to also say another quote from her, and this is me being biased. She also is quoted for saying, while most girls run away from home to marry, I ran away to teach. Quite the trailblazer for her time as well. So 1920 happens. Um, there was a ratification of the woman's right to vote. Um, but how in similar ways that we saw in 1870 black men being able to supposedly vote, there were many different obstacles that led them to not be able to vote. So the same thing happened in the 1920s with um, Black women. And so this became a constant struggle um, for the Black population at the time. There is a second wave that happens in feminism, and a lot of times the second wave of feminism in the mainstream media in particular, we're really focusing on wages and legal inequality. So, for example, the discussion of marital rape as something that wasn't illegal. And it wasn't until later that we start seeing um, that abortion rights become, it's not just about getting an abortion, but it's about having a right over your reproduction needs. And we usually refer to this second wave of feminism between the late 1960s to early 1980s. And a lot of that was really focused on there was a lot of struggle within the feminist community between those that were sex positive feminists and those that were anti-pornography feminists. At this time, we're looking at Miss America becoming more and more promoted, and we start seeing other things like the pornography industry really taking off. But all of this is happening in mainstream media. There's certainly this focus, this obsession with this. But while all of that is happening, you have other women like Polly Murray, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Ella Baker that actually predates this whole fight about should it be should we be sex positive or not? So, for example, Ella Baker was a proponent of participatory democracy. So, again, the idea of how we need to have when you are legislating, when you're talking about the livelihoods of people, those people need to be a part of those decisions. She's the one who's quoted for saying the personal is political. Fannie Lou Hamer linked voting rights to reproductive rights, especially focusing on states who were coercing women of color to undergo tubal ligation. Fannie Lou Hamer herself was coerced to undergo tubal ligation, and there were many cases of black women and women of color, indigenous women as well as Hispanic and Latino women um, who had to choose if they wanted to receive welfare, they had to undergo tubal ligation. And so this was not about can I even get an abortion? This is can I choose to have a child? So the fight is, and not only can I have a child, it's also can I not have a child? So there were so many, there was such a broad perspective that these African American women had to deal with. And Murray talked about it in terms of calling it a dual oppression. And so she brought back a lot of those early suffragettes like Sojourner Truth and Mary Church Terrell talking about how even when Jim Crow finished, you still had Jane Crow. You had a dual oppression, not just because of your race, but also because of your gender. A very important woman in this time period, I would say, would be Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm she was the she's the first uh, female candidate for the presidency um, in the United States. In 1972, she's quoted for saying, "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair." She remained active in politics pretty much until her death. She died here in Florida in the 1990s. Other women that you might be familiar with that kind of they grew up as feminists in this second wave, but they've had a more um, they had more of a presence as well during the third wave and this current wave, which they are Angela Davis, Toni Morrison, Audre Lorde, and Bell Hooks. I do want to give a shout out to Angela Davis. One of your lead discussions And actually, one of your required readings is her one of her chapters, her first chapter for her book, "Are Prisons Obsolete?" during the criminal justice portion of the course. And you actually have the full book available to you. So, take advantage of that. Read the book, it's pretty good. And Angela Davis is amazing. Toni Morrison, amazing. I mean, all of these women are just amazing. So you start seeing this sort of shift towards the end of the second wave and the beginning of the third wave of feminism during the 80s in particular, in which the conversation starts to shift into um, how feminism seems to be catering only to white women, and there needs to be something for black women. And there's this notion of turning nothing into something, and how can we make it better? And so, still without the term actually being used for intersectionality, but there's still the idea of it just keeps being brought back. So during this third wave of feminism, it's it's hard to really define when it started, because there's this blurring portion of time between the second wave and the third wave. But there is definitely one event that is there's two events that are really important during this time. One is Alice Walker's um, term of womanist, and how we need to focus on queer and people of color. And so Alice Walker is quoted by saying, "A woman who loves another woman, sexually and or non-sexually, she appreciates and prefers women's culture, women's emotional flexibility. She is committed to the survival and wholeness of an entire people, male and female, not a separatist, except periodically for health. Loves the spirit, loves the struggle, loves herself, regardless." That's how she defined a womanist. Um, she also has a quote about how um, womanist is to feminism as purple is to lavender. And the whole idea is that feminism falls under the umbrella of womanist. It's not the full picture, just like lavender would be considered a type of purple, but not all purple. Um, but there is one thing that a lot of people agree with, and that is that there is a political shift during 1991, and that is when Anita Hill testified that Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas had sexually harassed her at work. And it seems like that is the moment in time when we can really see a lot of things changing. So, for example, after her testimony, which you have a video, not the full testimony, it's a Vice compilation video, and it's for any of us who have gone through sexual harassment. I'm going to warn you that the video can be rough, so feel free to not watch it. For those of you who want to watch it, the video is available there. After her testimony, 27 women won seats in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate. 24 in the House of Representatives and 3 in the Senate. In previous years, the most women that were in either house, I think the most was 3 or 4, something like that. At one time, there were 4. So it went from barely any to 27. And so that really resounded with a lot of people. We also start seeing during this time, people start talking about intersectionality, specifically using the term and having an actual definition. And this is thanks to Kimberly Crenshaw. She's the one that coins the term, and she looks at it as the interconnected nature of social categorizations that create interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. In other words, uh, we we are we have different things that affect us, and they shape our life in very different ways, and we need to recognize that. I'm going to tell you a story of Michaela. This is adapted from Miriam Dobson's Intersectionality Guide, which is also on Canvas. So, here we go. Meet Michaela. Michaela is a stripy blue and red triangle. She loves herself and is proud of her blue and red stripes. Unfortunately, some people don't like Michaela. Some people think that she should go back home to the land of triangles, and some people fear her when she enters a store because she has stripes. But it's okay because, they don't see stripes, so, they can't be stripists. Luckily, there are groups that will support her, but they usually look like this. You have groups that are happy to embrace all triangles, and you have groups that are happy to help all stripes. And Michaela struggles to figure out if she should go to where the triangles are or where the stripes are. The groups barely talk to each other, and sometimes they even compete by going through oppression Olympics. Who has suffered more? Michaela herself can't really work out where to go. Is she more of a stripe or is she more of a triangle? So what does Michaela need? What Michaela needs is for triangles and stripes to work together because there cannot be equality or equity unless there is an equality for all. Intersectionality is the belief that oppressions are interlinked and cannot be solved alone. We're too close historically to the events unfolding to really define the start of the fourth wave. However, there seems to be a turning point that right now we think it might be around 2012 with the rise of different movements, specifically the rising leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is women-led, the use of social media, the Me Too movement, and the ever-increasing number of women in politics. We will talk more about the rising leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement. So I'm not going to specifically talk about it here today, but I do want you to keep that in mind. The leadership of Black Lives Matter, the women who started it, they are part of this fourth wave feminism. But at this moment in time, with the fourth wave feminism, where there is this shift towards inclusion rather than an exclusion of other perspectives, with an understanding that Black women are suffering from a triple oppression. There's an economic exploitation, there's a racial oppression, and there's a gender oppression. So Black women are connectors to different sectors, to different demographics that are going through different forms of oppression. And so rather than focusing on what makes them different from these groups, it's by looking at what these different groups need and looking at what they can share in common with one another. As other people, as examples of other people that are considered to be part of this fourth wave of feminism, we have Tarana Burke, who's the founder of the Me Too movement, and also the Squad, who are progressive lawmakers Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Ayanna Pressley. I'm going to leave you with a quote by Roxane Gay, who wrote the book Bad Feminist, if anybody's interested. Roxane Gay, Bad Feminist, great book. Really short too, by the way, and really easy read. Um, this is a quote from her. I think one of the most important things we can do as feminists is acknowledge that even though we have womanhood in common, we have to start to think about the ways in which we are different, how those differences affect us, and what kind of needs we have based on our differences. So it's not to use the differences to isolate or exclude others, but to recognize their needs so we can acknowledge and help them. In the spirit of this, our lead discussions will go over the myth of the missing Black father and queer performances of identity. Have a great one all.